A wonderful Wednesday to each of you, and welcome to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast, part 2 of our discussion about why Jaren Jackson Jr. is a definite all-defensive candidate, this time comparing him to his peers in the NBA, and also looking for the Grizzlies to right the ship against the San Antonio Spurs, who played very well last night, how the Grizzlies can get the job done against the Spurs team that you certainly want to keep out of the paint. That and much more on this edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Here we go.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, and welcome to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening and watching, you're having an outstanding start to your day. My name's Shawn Coleman, credentialed media member with the Grizzlies. Been covering the team for 4 years through Locked On Grizzlies. Your host here at Locked On Grizzlies, your Grizzlies every day. Find the show at Locked On Grizz, myself at StatsSAC. The show wherever you find it on podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, free on all platforms. No paywalls, anything like that. Free for you anytime. And make sure you check us out here on YouTube. Subscribe and listen on the podcast, but just subscribe and watch here on YouTube as well. Also want to remind you that anytime you subscribe, it not only lets us know you enjoy the show, it helps others be able to find the show as well. And we just want this to be the best experience it can be for anybody who wants to enjoy it. Also want to remind you of our title sponsor for today's episode, Prize Picks, daily fantasy made easy. If you go to prizepicks.com and your pick scores 1 point, a single point, you get a $50 bonus from Prize Picks. Check out prizepicks.com today. So really wanting to get back into the discussion because it's a fun discussion to have. Yesterday, I dived deep into, from a historical perspective, why the level of defensive activity that Jaren Jackson Jr. is showing this year, why it is what really is setting him apart, making his resume a valid resume for all defensive recognition this season. But at the end of the day, no matter how historic Jackson Jr.'s season has been, and no matter how well it correlates with recent years, with other players in recent years having doing what he's done and making all NBA teams, what matters for Jaren Jackson Jr. this year, the defensive activity is just one part of the story, right? Impact also matters. Reputation matters. Consistency, all that matters. And the wonderful thing is that Jaren Jackson Jr., he checks all the boxes there, just like he does when it comes to the historical perspective of things. At the end of the day, when it comes down to counting statistics, you can't beat that. Jaren Jackson Jr. right now stands at 104 blocks and 48 steals on the season. When it comes to Jaren Jackson Jr., he is second in the league in blocks. Let's be honest. The best singular source of blocks so far this year has been Miles Turner, who unfortunately is going to be out for an extended period of time. The same arguments that I'm coming up with Jaren Jackson Jr., you could come up with when it comes to Miles Turner, except Jaren is much better when it comes to creating steals. But Miles Turner has been absolutely outstanding when it comes to blocks this year. But in terms of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s block and steal activity, his defensive activity, this stock activity, that for big men really helps them out when it comes to their campaign to be on all defensive teams. Compare Jaren Jackson Jr. to other peers. Miles Turner, a 4.9% block percentage and a 1% steal percentage so far this year. Rudy Gobert, a 3.6% block percentage and a 1.1 steal percentage. But Jaren Jackson Jr. is at a 3.9 block percentage and a 1.4 steal percentage. According to Cleaning the Glass in non-garbage minutes, Jaren Jackson Jr. is the only player in the NBA, at least big in the NBA right now, who ranks in the 90th percentile of his position when it comes to, we'll say, I believe that it's bigs. He's the only big, through Cleaning the Glass, who ranks in the 90th percentile or better when it comes to blocks, block rate, but also ranks in the 75th percentile or better when it comes to steal rate. The point that I'm getting at is that when it comes to comparing Jaren Jackson Jr. to his peers, comparing him to other bigs in the NBA, what really stands out is that his ability to both impact the game through getting blocks, but also impacting the game through getting steals, his combination of being able to do both of those things is something that stands out to a level that no other big is able to match. That's why we've seen Jaren Jackson Jr. make so many of these impactful plays. If you remember, going back to last year, I had mentioned on a few occasions that what really stood out about Jaren Jackson Jr. when he returned from his injury was his impact, was the flashes that he showed of him being able to just, with one play, deter progress for the opposition, get in the way of the opposition being able to have success. He is doing that now game in and game out. The consistency that we're seeing of games where Jaren has multiple blocks, games where Jaren has multiple steals. This stretch here recently that I talked about yesterday, where he had 29 or so blocks over a 6-game period. He had, I believe, like in a 3 out of 4 game stretch, he had 5 or more blocks in 3 out of 4 games. That type of impact from solely disrupting the ability of the opposition to score is such a big thing. And the big reason why it also stands out when it comes to Jaren Jackson Jr. is it shows just how much of an impact he has had on the Grizzlies' ability to consistently have a source they can rely on that allows for them to score points, right? That's part of that whole reputation thing that we talk about. And let's not deny it. When it comes to a Draymond Green, when it comes to a Rudy Gobert, when it comes to a Ben Simmons when he's playing, when it comes to several other of these players, they legitimately are consistently in the all-defensive conversation because their impact is always clear inside and outside the box score when they're on the court. Well, with Jaren Jackson Jr., you're seeing that, right? From his direct ability to consistently create defensive activity, both through blocks and steals, that you don't see from hardly any other big in the NBA. The reason why that's impactful, the reason why that is reputation building for Jaren Jackson Jr. is because that alone contributes to the Grizzlies being able to create turnovers at a high rate, which lets them get out in transition at a high rate, which is a big reason why, because they do so well in transition. The Grizzlies are one of the best teams in transition in the league. Jaren Jackson Jr. helping the Grizzlies get in those positions offensively more often is a big reason why they are able to do it to the level that they are and why they consistently win. So that's where Jaren Jackson Jr.'s activity, beyond just being impressive itself in terms of his blocks and steals, that's where it goes from just being activity to being impactful. And that's where he starts to build a reputation, because the impact that activity is making is putting the Grizzlies in a position to win, and they're winning at a level few other teams are in the NBA right now. So if you want to talk about how Jaren Jackson Jr. builds that resume, how he's able to get that reputation going, how he's able to show that his activity leads to impact that compares favorably to other all-defensive candidates, that's exactly how it works. Not only are the blocks and steals themselves, those individual numbers, impressive, the consistency at which Jaren Jackson Jr. does them is impressive, but the fact of how those blocks and steals lead to turnovers, lead to defense, leading into offense for the Grizzlies, because they're able to get in transition more and be able to score off that. It allows for them, the rest of the team, working off Jackson Jr.'s activity. His defensive activity allows for the rest of the team to fall in line with the strength of this team that they do better than almost anybody in the NBA, and that's get offense through transition. That activity leading to impact, leading to winning plays, and leading the Grizzlies to have one of the best records in the NBA. That's how Jaren Jackson Jr. compares favorably to his peers, because his defensive activity leads to impact that consistently puts the Grizzlies in a position to win at a rate that few other teams are in the league. But beyond the defensive activity making impact itself, the threat of that defensive activity. Other teams having to know where Jaren Jackson Jr. is, that also in and of itself makes an impact, which adds to his all-defensive resume. I'll explain in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to talk about Prize Picks, right? Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. It's the opportunity for you to be able to pick a player. And it could be in different sports, but you could pick 2 to 5 players and an over-under on their projections on various prop bets, and you can win up to 10 times on any entry, and it's just you versus the projected winner. So if you want to talk about, Patrick Mahomes throwing for over 350 yards this weekend, while also thinking that John Morant may score 25 points in his game, you could play multiple sports at different times. And the great thing is if you go to prizepicks.com and you use the promo code NBA, you will get a $50 free dollars if your Prize Picks entry scores a single point. That's right. All users that deposit and use the promo code NBA will get $50 free dollars if your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Want to remind you that the trade deadline is now just a few weeks away. And on February 10th, the Locked On Podcast Network will have you covered. Locked On Fantasy NBA host Josh Lloyd, as well as Locked On Celtics host John Corrales, will host a special episode from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern on the day of the NBA trade deadline. Myself and my fellow Locked On hosts will all be there. If a trade occurs that involves the Grizzlies, I'll be right there to break it down for you. Make sure to check out that on the Locked On NBA podcast, a special trade line edition on February 10th from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern here on the Locked On NBA Podcast Network. So getting back to Jaren Jackson Jr., right? Talking about how, from a historical perspective, the level he's creating defensive activity is certainly impressive. But we've also talked about how one way he compares favorably to his peers is how well Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defensive activity feeds into the scheme that the Grizzlies use. Their formula for success really plays well off of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defensive activity. And so the impact of his defensive activity leading to sources of success that are allowing for the Grizzlies to win at rates that few other teams in the NBA, that's the impact that allows for Jaren Jackson Jr. to compare favorably to his peers. But getting more back on an individual level, Jaren Jackson Jr. still stands out because the impact that he makes defensively remains even if he's not getting those blocks and steals. The threat of Jaren Jackson Jr. remains in place even if he doesn't land the counting statistic. For instance, look at these numbers. Among bigs in the NBA, when it comes to on-off numbers, according to Cleaning the Glass and non-garbage time minutes, among bigs in the NBA, Jaren Jackson Jr. is 4th when it comes to the biggest differential, when it comes to the biggest drop in effective field goal percentage of when he is on the court versus when he is off. What I mean by that is this, is that teams shoot 3.4% worse when it comes to effective field goal percentage when Jaren Jackson Jr. is on the court versus when he's off the court. Among NBA bigs, only Nikola Jokic, Joseph Nurkic, and Rudy Gobert. Those are the only 3 bigs who have created a bigger differential when it comes to effective field goal percentage, who have shown to make a bigger impact that when they're on the court, teams are going to shoot worse, and their shot selection is going to be worse when those players are on the court versus when they're off. Jaren Jackson Jr. makes one of the biggest impacts in that specific perspective among bigs in the NBA. But if you want to see an even more exciting aspect of things, among NBA players this year that have played at least 1,000 minutes, there is no player in the NBA, no player who has made a bigger impact at deterring productivity at the rim than Jaren Jackson Jr. When Jaren Jackson Jr. is on the court versus when he is off, teams shoot 8.3% less at the rim when Jaren Jackson Jr. is on the court versus when he's off the court. That is the best mark in the NBA. So while you want to talk about the reputations of a Miles Turner or a Rudy Gobert or other players that you feel may be more effective sources of getting blocks themselves, of actually landing blocks, in terms of the more important aspect of things, you want to get blocks, but at the end of the day, your goal is to make it as hard as possible for your opposition to feel comfortable around the rim and make shots around the rim. Nobody is doing that better than Jaren Jackson Jr. this season. Numbers literally show that he is having the biggest impact of anybody in the NBA this year when it comes to deterring opponents' productivity at the rim. That's how outstanding he's been. And we've seen it in transition. We've seen it in the half court. He does it in a variety of different ways, and that's what makes it so exciting. That's why we've seen this defensive turnaround for the Grizzlies. And again, you want to talk about Jaren Jackson Jr.'s individual production helping the team out. Jaren Jackson Jr. being able to do that, being able to anchor the defense himself by being as big of a deterrent at the rim as he is, that lets the rest of the defense settle into place to be able to focus on the perimeter and make it harder for teams to get into a rhythm from three. That, again, is the impact that Jaren Jackson Jr.'s individual activity, individual production is making. So second in the league in blocks. The only NBA big to be in the 90th or better percentile in block percentage and not in 75th percentile or better in steal percentage. And again, the most impactful defender in the NBA when it comes to deterring success at the rim. That sounds like a pretty damn good all-defensive resume building up. But consider this, right? Consider, again, looking at the broader scheme of things, looking at the broader picture besides just what Jaren Jackson Jr. is doing, anchoring the Grizzlies defense in the post. Consider this. Jaren Jackson Jr. is in the 86th percentile of all players in terms of limiting points per possession, and the 88th percentile, in limiting points per possession, and 86th percentile in limiting points per play in the half court. So you want to talk about Jaren individually getting the counting statistics, making the impact, doing what he can do on defense to make life hard for the opposition. But now you start to see, in terms of the scheme of the basketball itself, in terms of how Jaren Jackson Jr. as a defender is impacting the effectiveness of the entire Grizzlies team when they're in their half-court defense, you see it there. When he's on the court, the Grizzlies become one of the better teams in half-court defense among all lineups in the NBA. That's the type of impact, again, Jaren Jackson Jr. is making. And that's why the Grizzlies, with him on the court, they are so productive in terms of their defense. That's why when Dillon Brooks comes back, the Grizzlies turn immediately into a top 5 defensive team in the NBA, because it's hard to find a combination to the point of Jaren Jackson Jr. and Dillon Brooks. It's hard to find other combinations in the NBA that are so effective at guarding the opposition's best offensive perimeter talent, while also combining it, again, with one of, if not the best, rim defenders in the NBA. That's why we're all hoping to get Dillon Brooks back as soon as possible, so that we can see Ja Morant and Desmond Bane lead the Grizzlies offense, but Desmond and Jaren lead the Grizzlies defense. So whatever opinion you may have about Jaren Jackson Jr., sure, that's fine. But I'm here to tell you right now, if your opinion is that Jaren Jackson Jr. does not deserve to be in the competition when it comes to the all-defensive teams, or that Jaren Jackson Jr. is not a premier defender in the NBA, you are 100% wrong. You are 100% wrong. Because I've given you plenty of percentages. I've given you plenty of stats. You've got the historical perspective. You've got where he compares to his peers. You've got the fact that it's not just his individual production, but it's how it makes an impact for the Grizzlies as a team as a whole and with how much they're winning at a level that few other teams are. I'm always here to respect opinions, and that's fine. And if you have your logic, that's perfectly fine as well. But when it comes to Jaren Jackson Jr. being a candidate for an all-defensive team, I will stack up his resume against anybody else's in the NBA, and I'll do it with confidence, knowing that how good the numbers are and how much they impact both when Jaren Jackson, from an individual perspective, is on the court and how much they play into the Grizzlies' success overall. I'll take all that body of work, and I'll stack it up against anybody's in the NBA with confidence when it comes to proving that Jaren Jackson Jr. deserves all defensive recognition and is also building a reputation of being one of the premier defenders in the NBA. Well, that activity, that rim protection, that overall presence that Jaren Jackson Jr. consistently displays, it's going to have to be on display tomorrow night against the San Antonio Spurs, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. But before we do, let's talk about Built Bar, right? Built Bar is an awesome option. Listen, I love snacks or sources of food, what have you, that can give me energy, that can give me health benefits, that taste great, and that's Built Bar. You can have it in the breakfast for morning, or you can have it in the afternoon as a snack. But regardless of when you have it, if you go to Built.com right now, you put in the promo code LOCKED15, you'll get 15% off your next order from Built Bar. And there's over 18 different flavors to choose from. Make sure you check out Built.com today. Again, you go to Built.com, put in the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your next order from Built Bar. Listen, we can't thank you enough for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day. But of course, also want to suggest that you check out both the Locked On Titans podcast on our NFL network with the great host Tyler Rowland. Unfortunately, we're not talking about the Titans going into their next opponent in the AFC title game. We're talking about big decisions that await the Titans in the offseason. But regardless of who your favorite NFL team is, check out the Locked On NFL podcast show of your favorite team as your second listen of the day. Or if you're keeping up with what's going on MLB baseball, because of the lockout in the Hall of Fame and all that different stuff, check out the Locked On MLB network shows as well. And of course, Locked On Braves, which covers your 2021 World Series champions. Got hockey as well. Locked On Preds. Whatever sport is your second listen of the day. After Locked On Grizzlies, check out Locked On Titans, Locked On Preds, Locked On Braves, what have you, when it comes to your second listen of the day across all different platforms of the Locked On Podcast Network. So here we go. The Grizzlies have had 2 days off, right? And they are finally receiving some good news. As was appeared on Twitter yesterday, it was confirmed today, though he's listed as questionable, Desmond Bane is out of health and safety protocols, while Tyus Jones and Kyle Anderson do remain. Brandon Clark is also questionable for tonight's game. But the big key is Desmond Bane hopefully is back. And that certainly is going to be a needed presence for the Grizzlies. Because at the end of the day, the Grizzlies are facing off against the San Antonio Spurs. And again, on paper, this should be a game that the Grizzlies should clearly be favored in, and a game where the Grizzlies should clearly take care of business. However, the San Antonio Spurs, though they're 18-30, and though they are only 4-10 this calendar year, they're coming off a very impressive victory. One thing that certainly will help out the Grizzlies is that the Spurs will be on the second half of a back-to-back, while the Grizzlies have had 2 days off. So the Grizzlies should have freshness on their side. But the Spurs last night against the Rockets, and let's consider it was against the Rockets, 82 paint points, 8 players in double figures, 38 total assists, with DeJounte Murray leading the charge. And this Spurs team is healthy. This Spurs team was playing Spurs basketball last night. Everybody getting involved, passing galore, getting into the paint, scoring, having a lot of success. The Grizzlies are going to have to make sure that they do not let this Spurs team get hot starting out. That is a big, big key for this Grizzlies team. Again, as we typically see in a Grizzlies-Spurs matchup, the Grizzlies are going to have the size advantage in this game. Even though Jakob Poeltl has had a very good season for the Spurs, the combination of Steven Adams and Jaren Jackson Jr., that should play into the Grizzlies' favor. Offensively, because we talk about it all the time, right? Steven Adams' ability on the offensive boards, Jaren's inside-outside scoring, that's where they should be able to do it. The Grizzlies should be able to find their success in the lane with Ja, Steven Adams, Jaren, and others being able to have the size advantage or just the talent advantage of being able to score in the paint and at the rim. That should give the Grizzlies a clear advantage in this game. However, to me, the bigger storyline is what the Grizzlies are going to do on defense. And we know that Taylor Jenkins constantly talks about it. The Grizzlies have got to defend the paint outward. That's exactly what they're going to have to do tonight. Again, 82 points last night for the Spurs in the paint. And this is two teams facing each other who are not among the best when it comes to shooting the three. They are among the best when it comes to scoring in the paint. So it just as much as it is just as important for the Grizzlies to use their size advantage to score in the paint on their offensive end, it's going to be just as important for that size. Like we just talked about, Jaren to be the deterrent at the rim, Steven Adams to be the deterrent at the rim, getting defensive rebounds. The Grizzlies are going to need to do a very good job without fouling of making life hard in the paint for San Antonio while also finding their own success on their end of the court. The reason why, though, that Desmond Bane returning becomes a big development for the Grizzlies is because it's not necessarily who makes or takes the most threes tomorrow night or tonight. For me, the key is going to be who strikes the best offensive balance, who's able to have enough success in the paint offensively to where they can then work out high percentage looks from three as a counter once defenses collapse. And the Grizzlies, when they have Desmond Bane on the court to do that, are a lot more consistent in doing that than when they don't have him. Because that's the difference maker that Desmond Bane is going to be. He is the best three-point threat on either team. And the Grizzlies need to utilize him in that exact role to help strike the better offensive balance among these two teams. Because the Spurs are going to be a threat. And the big key for the Grizzlies is to get back to what they've been doing. If you remember about a week or 10 days ago, I broke down how the Grizzlies were winning every quarter, how they had a positive net rating in every single quarter. And the formula that they had been following is the starting lineup setting the defensive tone early, the bench in the starting lineup getting the offense going in the second quarter, and then Ja and the halftime adjustments, allowing for the Grizzlies to be the best third quarter team in the NBA. That's the exact formula this Grizzlies team needs to follow tonight. They need to set the tone early. The Grizzlies defense needs to set the tone early by making it clear that San Antonio is going to have a very hard time finding consistency scoring in the lane. If the Grizzlies can do that, and they also can limit the effectiveness of DeJounte Murray, I think other things will then fall into place. The Grizzlies should be able to have reasonable to good success scoring in the paint on their own. They should be able to get the extra possession battle in their favor, creating turnovers, getting offensive rebounds, so on. They should utilize the best shooter on either team in in Desmond Bane, but you hope Jaren Jackson Jr. steps out as well. But here's the big key. The day before he's likely going to be named an all-star starter, Ja Morant just needs to go out and dominate again. We've seen him do it against the Spurs plenty of times. Though DeJounte Murray is certainly a capable defender and could do a pretty decent job against what others can do against Ja, we've seen that Ja is almost getting to the point of being matchup proof. Let Ja be Ja. Defend the paint. Utilize Bane and Jackson Jr. as being the best shooting talents on the court and make your freaking free throws. And the Grizzlies should find themselves in a very favorable position to win the ball game. It's going to be an exciting time when it comes to watching the Grizzlies tonight hopefully get a victory. And on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. We'll break down, obviously, the Grizzlies' victory over the Spurs and also prepare for what hopefully will be a very special day for the Grizzlies as we await the announcement of Ja Morant as a 2022 NBA All-Star starter. That and much more on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. But until then, check out Locked On NBA. Yours truly making his Locked On NBA debut today. Make Locked On NBA your second listen of the day after Locked On Grizzlies is your first listen. Have a great day. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Locked On Grizzlies podcast.